Hello everyone, and welcome back. We often think of monsters as things that lurk in the dark, in the whispered tales of folklore. But sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we create ourselves, forged in the crucible of fear and misunderstanding. And sometimes the face we label a monster hides the most gentle of souls. In the heart of Victorian London, a city of stark contrasts, of opulent wealth and grinding poverty, of scientific progress and deep-seated superstition, there lived a man who embodied this paradox. His name was Joseph Merrick, but the world would come to know him by a crueler title, the Elephant Man. But to begin his story in the grimy, gaslit tent of a penny dreadful freak show is to miss the point. It's to accept the label the world gave him. So let's not start there. Let's start where his story, in a sense, was reborn. Picture a quiet room in the London hospital, late in the year 1886. The air is thick with the scent of carbolic acid and coal smoke. In this small private space, a man sits hunched over a delicate construction. His hands, one impossibly large and club, like the other slender and fine, work with painstaking precision. He is building a cathedral from cardboard, a perfect replica of St. Philip's Church. He is a man who writes poetry, who discusses literature with the most famous actress of the age, and who receives personal visits from the Princess of Wales. He is a man of quiet dignity, of immense sensitivity, and of a profound and gentle spirit. This man is Joseph Merrick. Now hold that image in your mind. The artist, the gentleman, the poet. And then ask yourself the question that baffled London society: how did this man, this soul, come to be displayed in a shop across the road from this very hospital, under a painted banner that screamed he was half a man and half an elephant? The answer is not a simple medical history. It is a journey into the darkest corners of human cruelty and the brightest sparks of compassion. Our story begins not in London, but in Leicester on the 5th of August, 1862. Joseph Carey Merrick was born a seemingly healthy child to Mary Jane and Joseph Rockley Merrick. For the first few years of his life there was nothing to suggest the profound tragedy that would engulf him. His mother, a Sunday school teacher, doted on him. It was a normal. Around the age of 5, small lumpy growths started to appear on his skin. They were subtle at first, easily dismissed, but they didn't stop. His bones began to deform, his right arm and both his legs swelled to enormous proportions. The skin on his face and body thickened, forming great, pendulous folds. His head ballooned, the bone of his forehead growing into a massive, misshapen protuberance that distorted his features, pushing one eye askew and twisting his mouth into what appeared to be a permanent snarl. To speak, he had to force air past a massive growth in his mouth, rendering his voice a muffled, almost unintelligible groan to those who didn't know him. The great tragedy of his life had begun, an insidious creeping transformation that he was powerless to stop. The cause was a complete mystery. His mother, in her desperation to find a reason, clung to a story that would follow Joseph for the rest of his life. She claimed that during her pregnancy she had been knocked down and frightened by an elephant at a local fair. In the deeply superstitious climate of the 19th century, the idea of maternal impression, that a powerful emotional experience in a pregnant woman could physically manifest in her child, was a widely accepted, if not scientifically proven, theory. For Joseph, this story became both a curse and a strange kind of comfort. It offered an explanation, however fanciful. It meant he wasn't inherently monstrous, but the victim of a freak accident, a moment of terror that had imprinted itself upon his very cells. It was a narrative he would repeat his entire life, a fragile shield against the unexplainable horror of his own body. His mother was his only shield against the world's cruelty, but that shield was just 11 years old. Mary Jane Merrick died of pneumonia. Her death was the single greatest catastrophe of Joseph's young life. He lost not just his mother, but his only source of unconditional love and acceptance. His father remarried quickly, and his new stepmother, a woman with children of her own, had no room in her heart or her home for a boy she saw as a burden, a disfigured creature who brought shame. The quiet cruelties began. She would refuse to give him full meals, claiming the food he was given was worth more than the work he could do. His father, once a protector, became a bystander and then a participant in the abuse. The taunts of neighborhood children were one thing. The cold, daily rejection from his own family was a soul-crushing torment. At 13, the pressure to earn, he left school and found work in a cigar factory. For 2 years he toiled, rolling cigars with his one good hand. But his deformity was progressive. His right hand grew larger and more unwieldy, making the delicate work impossible. He was let go, his father. A hawker then acquired a peddler's license for him, and Joseph was sent out onto the streets with a heavy tray of goods from his father's. This was a new level of hell. He was no longer hidden away in a factory. He was on public display. He would limp through the cobbled streets of Leicester, his face hidden behind a burlap sack, with a slit cut for his one good eye, a great hooded cap pulled low over his enormous head. But the disguise did little. His shambling gait, his enormous cloaked figure drew attention. People would follow him, taunting, screaming. Housewives slammed doors in his face. His wares remained unsold. Each night he would return home, not just empty, handed, but having endured a day of relentless public humiliation, only to face the wrath of his father for his failure. The beatings became more frequent, more severe. Finally, at the age of 17, Joseph Merrick reached his breaking point. He could no longer endure the abuse at home or the torment on the streets. He left his father's house for good. For a time he lived with an uncle, but eventually, with no means to support himself, he made the most desperate decision of his life. In late 1879 he admitted himself to the Leicester Union Workhouse. The Victorian Workhouse was not a charity. It was a place of last resort, designed to be. It was a prison for the poor. Families were separated. Inmates were subjected to grueling labor, strict discipline, and a monotonous, meager diet. For Joseph, it was 4 years of grim, soul-destroying routine. He was surrounded by the desperate, the broken, and the dying. The sheer monotony and hopelessness of the place was a living death. Yet it was here, in the depths of the workhouse, that the spark of his spirit refused to be extinguished. Joseph knew he could not stay there forever. He had to find a way out. But what options did a man like him have? What place was there in the world for him? The answer was as horrifying as it was logical. If the world was determined to stare at him, to treat him as a spectacle, then perhaps he could make them pay for the privilege. He had heard of the world of traveling fairs and sideshows, the world of freaks and curiosities. It was a brutal, exploitative world, but it offered something the workhouse did not: a sliver of autonomy, a chance to earn a living. It was a horrifying choice: the slow death of the soul in the workhouse, or the public degradation of the freak show. He chose the latter. He contacted a Leicester music hall comedian named Sam Tora, a seasoned showman, saw the potential immediately. He agreed to take Merrick on, giving him the ghastly stage name that would haunt him forever. The Elephant Man Tora organized a small tour of the East Midlands. They were soon joined by another showman, Tom Norman. Norman was a shrewd businessman, known as the Silver King for his. He wasn't a cruel man by the standards of his day, but he was an opportunist. He saw in Merrick a prime attraction. He brought Joseph to London and set him up in a vacant shop on Whitechapel Road, directly across from the London hospital. A large, garishly painted canvas hung outside, depicting a monstrous figure, half man, half beast. For the price of a penny, the public could come in and gaze upon the terrible creature. Inside, the reality was even grimmer. Joseph would sit on a small stool, wearing nothing but a pair of trunks, while Norman, the barker, would deliver his spiel. He would point out Joseph's deformities: the elephant, like skin, the trunk of flesh hanging from his face, the twisted limbs. He would repeat the story of his mother and the elephant. The crowd would gawk, some with morbid curiosity, some with pity, others with revulsion. For Joseph, it was a ritual of humiliation. He was no longer a person, he was an object, a thing to be stared at and recoiled from. He endured it with a quiet, heart-breaking stoicism. This was his escape from the workhouse. This was his life now. He made enough money to live, but the cost to his spirit was immeasurable, and yet this grim existence in this specific location was about to change his life forever. Because across the road, in the hallowed halls of the London hospital, a brilliant and ambitious young surgeon named Frederick Treves was about to hear rumours of a most unusual sight. Frederick Treves was a man of science, a rising star in the world of anatomy and surgery. He was a product of his time, precise, methodical, driven by a thirst for knowledge and a desire to make his mark. To him, the human body was a machine, a complex system to be understood, catalogued, and when possible repaired. When he heard tales of the Elephant Man exhibition in the shop across the street, his interest was purely scientific. Here was a unique pathological case, a walking textbook of deformity, the likes of which he had never seen. He arranged a private viewing with Tom Norman. The memory of that first encounter would stay with Treves for the rest of his life, and he would later record it in his memoirs with a vivid, almost Gothic, horror. Treves described the room as cold and dark, the only light coming from the open shop door. He saw the garish paintings, the theatrical setup, and then the creature itself. As Norman pulled back a curtain, Treves was confronted with what he called the most disgusting specimen of humanity that I have ever seen. He described Joseph not as a man, but as an it, a thing. He saw the monstrous head, the cauliflower. Like growths of skin, the shapeless fin, like right arm, the twisted back, the clubbed feet. He noted the foul odour that emanated from the growths. His scientific mind reeled, trying to categorize, to diagnose. Was it elephantiasis? A congenital deformity? He knew he had to study this case more closely. He paid Norman and arranged for Merrick to be brought to the hospital for a proper examination. Smuggling him in was an ordeal. Joseph, wrapped in a long black coat, his face hidden by the cap and veil, was bundled into a hansom cab with the blinds drawn. Like a fugitive, in the sterile environment of the dissecting room, Treves photographed and measured him, documenting every aspect of his condition with clinical detachment. He found that beneath the layers of growths, Joseph's skin was in credible detachment. He also noted that his left arm was perfectly formed. Like that of a woman, a startling island of normalcy in a sea of deformity. He also discovered that Joseph's genitalia were normal, meaning that whatever had ravaged his body had spared this part of him. Through the muffled grunts and groans, Treves assumed Merrick was an imbecile, his intellect as deformed as his body. After the examination, Treves gave Merrick his card in case he ever needed help, and sent him back to the shop. He had his notes, his photographs. The scientific curiosity was satisfied. He presented the case to the Pathological Society of London, a triumph of clinical observation, and then he moved on. For Frederick Treves, the Elephant Man was a closed case. The exhibition continued. But the tide of public opinion in Victorian England was beginning to turn against such displays. A growing sense of public decency and morality saw freak shows as indecent and exploitative. The police began to crack down. The shop on Whitechapel Road was shut down. Tom Norman, ever the pragmatist, saw that his star attraction was becoming more trouble than he was worth in England. But the continent was a different story. An Austrian showman offered to take Merrick on a tour of Europe. For Joseph, it was a terrifying prospect, but he had no other choice. Norman gave him his life savings, almost £50, a considerable sum, and sent him off with this new manager. It was a disastrous mistake. The trip to Belgium was a nightmare. The new showman was not a gruff but fair businessman like Norman. He was a predator. He treated Joseph with contempt, exhibiting him to dwindling crowds who were more hostile than curious. Then in Brussels the man showed his true colours. He beat Joseph, stole his entire life savings, and abandoned him, alone and penniless, in a foreign city where he could not speak the language. This was the absolute nada of Joseph Merrick's life. He was utterly alone, destitute, and helpless. He had escaped the workhouse only to find a far worse prison. He had no money, no friends, and no way home. Every door was closed to him. His monstrous appearance, which had been his only source of income, was now a terrifying liability. He was a pariah. For any other, but Joseph possessed a core of resilience that was as extraordinary as his physical condition. Somehow he had to get back to London. It was his only hope. He managed to scrape together enough money for a ticket on a steamer to Harwich, and from there a train to London. He arrived at Liverpool Street Station in the summer of 1886. The journey, confined in the crowded, hot train carriage, he had become a spectacle of horror. When he stepped onto the platform in London, a crowd immediately gathered. They pointed, they shouted, they pressed in on him. The police were called to control the mob. Joseph, exhausted, terrified, and unable to make himself understood, collapsed. He was cornered, a hunted animal. He was about to be arrested for vagrancy, a fate that would surely have led to the asylum or back to the dreaded workhouse. But then, in his moment of ultimate desperation, he remembered the doctor from the hospital, the card. He fumbled in his coat pocket and pulled out the small, worn piece of pasteboard. On it were the words, Dr. Frederick Treves, London Hospital. It was the longest of long shots, a fragile, desperate lifeline. The police, seeing the card, were perplexed, but decided to investigate. They sent a message to the hospital, and Frederick Treves, sitting in his office, received a startling call. The police had detained a strange, deformed man at Liverpool Street Station who had his card, and they didn't know what to do with him. Treves was shocked. He had all but forgotten about the Elephant Man. He hurried to the station and found Joseph huddled in a waiting room, a terrified, dejected figure surrounded by curious onlookers. Treves took him back to the hospital, but this presented a new problem. The London hospital was for patients with curable diseases. Joseph's condition was chronic, untreatable. He couldn't be admitted as a regular patient. Treves placed him in an isolation ward in the hospital's attic, a small set of rooms at the very back of the building. He was fed and cared for, but his future was completely uncertain. He was, in effect, a medical refugee. Treves began to study him again. But this time, something was different. The initial clinical detachment began to fade. He spent more time with Joseph, trying to communicate with him. It was a slow, difficult process. Joseph's speech was severely impaired, and he was shy, withdrawn, conditioned by a lifetime of abuse to expect nothing but rejection. Treves still harbored the belief that Merrick was intellectually deficient, an imbecile, as he termed it. The hospital committee met to decide Joseph's fate. They concluded that they could not house him permanently. He would have to go to an asylum or a home for incurables. For Joseph, this was a death sentence. The thought of being locked away again, this time forever, terrified him. Treves, now feeling a growing sense of responsibility, was dismayed. He decided to make a public appeal. He wrote a letter to the Times newspaper describing Joseph's plight. He told the story of his life of hardship, his gentle nature, and his desperate need for a home. He asked for donations to fund Merrick's care. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Victorian public, so often the source of his torment, now showed its compassionate side. Money poured in from all corners. The public was captivated by the story of the gentle soul trapped in a monstrous body. Enough money was raised to guarantee Joseph could live at the hospital for the rest of his life. The committee, swayed by the public outcry and the secured funding, agreed. The small attic rooms would be his permanent home. For the first time in his life, Joseph Merrick had a sanctuary. This was the beginning of the most remarkable chapter of his life. Freed from the constant struggle for survival and the fear of rejection, the real Joseph Merrick began to emerge. The transformation was astonishing. Treves, who had once dismissed him as an imbecile, discovered he had been profoundly wrong. As Joseph grew more comfortable, his speech, though still difficult, became clearer. He revealed himself to be intelligent, sensitive, and possessed of a surprisingly romantic and gentle nature. Treves learned that Joseph could read and write. He brought him books, and they would discuss them. Joseph loved romantic novels and poetry. He was not the dull, brutish creature Treves had first assumed. He was a man with a rich inner world, a world that had been hidden away, locked behind the prison of his flesh, and the silence imposed by fear. The nurses, initially terrified of him, also came to see the man behind the deformities. They discovered his kindness, his courtesy, his almost childlike innocence. He was unfailingly polite, always grateful for the smallest kindness. The fear in the hospital corridors was replaced by affection and a fierce, protective loyalty. And yet he was still profoundly isolated. His world was the two small rooms in the hospital attic. Treves realized that what Joseph needed more than anything was human connection, a sense of normalcy. He needed to meet people who would not recoil in horror. But how Treves came up with an idea. He asked a young, pretty widow he knew to visit Merrick, to enter his room, smile, and shake his hand. It was a calculated risk. The woman steeled herself and entered the room. She walked up to Joseph, smiled warmly, and extended her hand. Joseph, who had likely never been touched with such kindness by a woman other than his own mother, was completely overwhelmed. He took her hand and broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. That simple, human gesture broke through years of accumulated pain and isolation. It proved to him that he could be seen as a man, not a monster. This opened the floodgates. Treves began to arrange for more visitors. The breakthrough came when he contacted one of the most famous and beloved actresses of the Victorian stage, Madge Kendall. She was known for her kindness and compassion. Though she never met Merrick in person, believing the shock might be too much for both of them, she became his champion. She sent him signed photographs of herself, she wrote to him, she sent him books, and she used her society connections to encourage others to visit. Her endorsement made it fashionable, an act of high society charity, to visit the Elephant Man, and people came. Dukes and duchesses, writers and artists. The cream of London society made the pilgrimage to his small rooms. They would come expecting to see a monster, to satisfy a morbid curiosity, but they would leave having met a man. They were charmed by his gentle demeanor and his surprising intelligence. Perhaps the most significant of these visits came from the highest level of society. Queen Victoria's daughter-in-law Alexandra, the Princess of Wales, heard of Joseph's story and asked to meet him. She visited him at the hospital, not once, but several times. She treated him with grace and kindness, shaking his hand and sitting with him, talking as if he were any other gentleman. She even sent him a signed photograph of herself and sent him a Christmas card every year. For Joseph, this was the ultimate validation. To be acknowledged by royalty was to be acknowledged by the world. It was a sign that he had transcended his status as an outcast. The boy who had been beaten by his father and driven from his home was now a friend of the future Queen of England. With this new life came new experiences. His benefactors, wanting to give him a taste of the world he had never known, arranged for him to visit the countryside. It was a complex operation. He would be transported at night in a private carriage with dark blinds to a secluded cottage on a private estate. There for a few weeks each summer he experienced a freedom he had only dreamed of. He could walk in the woods, sit by a stream, and listen to the birds without fear of being seen. He was surrounded by nature, beauty, and peace. He would later write to Treves that these trips were the happiest moments of. He also fulfilled a lifelong dream of visiting a real theatre. The manager of the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, arranged for him to attend a Christmas pantomime. He was smuggled into the royal box, hidden behind a special curtain, so he could see the stage without the audience seeing him. He was completely captivated, like a child seeing magic for the first time. For a few hours he was part of the normal world, sharing in its simple joys. In his rooms at the hospital he filled his time with his passions. He read voraciously. He wrote letters and even some simple, heartfelt poetry. His most famous project was the cardboard model of St. Philip's Church, which he had seen on a trip to the Midlands. The delicate, intricate work was a testament to his patience and his yearning. The church, a symbol of sanctuary and peace, was something he was building with his own hands. It was a metaphor for the life he was constructing for himself within the walls of the hospital. He was no longer just a patient or a specimen. He was a resident, a hobbyist, a man with his own small but rich life. He had found his place. But despite the comfort and acceptance, he found his condition continued. The growths continued to grow. The weight of his head became immense, making it difficult for him to even sit upright. He suffered from chronic joint pain and bronchitis. His health was fragile. Treves and the hospital staff did what they could to make him comfortable. But his condition was relentless. There was no cure, and overshadowing everything was a simple, heart-breaking desire. Joseph once confided in Treves that his greatest wish was to be able to sleep lying down. Like other people, because of the enormous weight of his head, he had to sleep sitting up, his head resting on his knees. If he were to lie down, the sheer weight of his skull would likely asphyxiate him or dislocate his neck. It was a constant, painful reminder of his otherness, a basic human comfort that was denied. On the morning of the 11th of April, 1890, a house surgeon doing his rounds found that Joseph was unusually quiet. He entered the room and found him lying on his back in his bed. He appeared to be asleep, but he was not. Joseph Merrick was dead. He was just 27 years old. Treves was called to the scene. He examined the body and concluded that Joseph had made a conscious decision that night. He had wanted, just once, to feel what it was like to be normal. In that attempt, the weight of his head had dislocated his neck, and he had died instantly. It was not a suicide in the conventional sense, but a tragic accident born of a desperate, understandable wish. It was the final, cruel irony of his life. His pursuit of a simple moment of normalcy had been the very thing that killed. He made plaster casts of Joseph's head and limbs and preserved his skeleton, which remains at Queen Mary University of London to this day, a subject of continued medical study. For decades, the cause of his condition remained a mystery. It was initially diagnosed as elephantiasis, then neurofibromatosis. But in 1976, a new theory emerged, Proteus syndrome, an incredibly rare genetic disorder that causes massive, asymmetrical overgrowth of bones, skin, and other tissues. It perfectly matched the known symptoms of Merrick's case. In the early 21st century, DNA tests were performed on his skeleton, but the results were inconclusive, possibly due to the bleaching. The medical mystery of Joseph Merrick in some ways endures. But the true story of Joseph Merrick is not about the diagnosis. It's about the man. It's about the profound resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. He was born into a world that had no place for him, a world that judged him, feared him, and abused him based on his appearance. Yet he never became the monster they thought he was. He retained his gentle nature, his curiosity, his capacity for love and friendship. His life poses a timeless question. What is it that makes us human? Is it the vessel of our body, or the spirit that resides within? The tragedy of the elephant man is not just that he was deformed, but that it took so long for the world to look past the deformities and see the beautiful, gentle soul that was there all along. In the end, his quiet life in the London hospital was not a story of defeat, but a testament to the power of kindness to heal, and the enduring need for every human being to be seen, to be known, and to be loved. That is all for today. If you enjoyed this journey into the story of a life that history almost forgot, be sure to like and subscribe for more.